All right, good afternoon, everyone, once again, and welcome to today's USAID ILRG webinar, which is focusing on private wildlife estates. We have 4 presentations that will focus on different aspects of policy, practice, and some experiences as well. So just to say, all participants are automatically muted. And also you can customize your view to either focus on the presentation or the presenter. You can chat with the panelists and attendees as well in the chat box. So please feel free to send your messages in there, and also just introduce yourself so that we know who is attending and where you're coming from. In addition to this, if you have questions for any of the presenters, please post those in the Q&A box. These will be answered at the end of the session, at the end of all the presentations, that is, during the Q&A session. If you have any questions, please feel free to just post them in the chat box, general questions that is, but questions pertaining to the presentations in the Q&A box, and also indicate who the question is addressed to. Without further ado, I will hand you over to today's facilitator, Alston.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. It's a pleasure to have you on this webinar, which is one of the many series that we have up to September, and specifically for wildlife and for private wildlife estate and the community game ranching. We have 2. This is the first one, which will focus on private wildlife estates, and we have another one next Thursday, which will be focused on community game ranching, and it will be at the same time. Today we have 4 presenters, as Chilombo has indicated. The first one is Susan Siamundere, who is going to give us the status according to the government position, and also she will touch on the policy. Susan Siamundere is a senior conservation officer at the Department of National Parks and Wildlife. The other speaker is Chanda Mwale, who is the operations manager at the Wildlife Producers Association of Zambia, which is a grouping for the private wildlife estates owners in the country. Chanda will be talking to us also on the status of private wildlife estates in Zambia. The third speaker is Chorwe Wamia, who is going to share with us the database that Wildlife Producers Association of Zambia has developed, of course, in partnership with the Department of National Parks. The fourth and last speaker for today is Ian Robinson. Ian Robinson is going to share his experience and knowledge in managing private wildlife estates in Zambia. So these are our presenters. The first presenter is Susan Siamundere. Susan, please, you can go ahead and make your presentation.
Okay, many thanks to you, Austin, and I want to greet everyone. Good afternoon. Okay, without wasting much of your time, my names are Susan Siamundere. I'm Senior Conservation Officer at the Department of National Parks and Wildlife. I will look at the status and the policy on private wildlife estates. Do you want me to put it on the full screen like now?
Yes, Susan, please go ahead and share.
Oh, okay, thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I'll give you a bit of the background to the concept of private wildlife estates.
Susan, if you are unable to share, I think Chilombo can help to share the screen for you. So you can.
It's not seen.
I'm not seeing the screen. I'm not seeing your screen.
Okay. Okay, maybe let her share it.
Shilombo, go ahead, share the screen for Susan.
Okay, just give me a few seconds to pull it up.
Okay. Here.
Are we seeing it now?
Yes, Susan, your screen is on. You can go ahead now.
Okay.
Okay, so the background to the concept of private wildlife estates in Zambia, it started in 1983 under the Wildlife Act, but there was a specific regulation that was, according to this document that I managed to get, was regulation number 8. That was almost a paradigm shift from the Eurocentric type of conservation to a partial Afrocentric, which was more opening to people to, because in the Eurocentric, it was all wildlife was supposed to be managed with the state. But the partial was opening up for people that were interested to keep wildlife so that they have the user rights to wildlife. So the second point is the driving force. So one would ask, what was really driving? What was the driving factor to this shift? So it was the increasing competition in consumptive utilization of wildlife. Because as you know, there are times when we have this resident hunting period when people apply to go and hunt. So increasingly, the department was having a lot of applications for people that wanted to use that. So it was one way of giving people the private sector to have wildlife so that at least at their own time, they could utilize it. The other reason was the reduced pressure on game management areas where hunting is permissible. So these areas, we thought maybe if the private sector would manage their own wildlife and use it at their own time, then there will be reduced pressure on the GMAs. The other point was it was seen as a conservation strategy. Some species, there are certain selected species whose populations were going down. I would give an example of the Kafiwe lechwe. So we thought people, or it was felt that if people kept the Kafiwe lechwe, people would hunt them in those areas, apart from just the GMAs. Okay, so that was the one I gave was the state perspective. Now coming to the private sector, of course, I'll give you a background that most of the people, the pioneers for this private wildlife estate were the cattle ranchers, mostly in southern central provinces of Zambia. So on their side, the driving factor was the challenges they were experiencing in cattle ranching as a result of diseases such as foot and mouth. Then also climate change related issues such as drought, especially in southern province. Then the other point was game ranching was seen as a business opportunity because for livestock, it was maybe just the meat and the skins. But for wildlife, it was seen that there were many values, starting from game viewing, live sales, meat, trophies, than livestock. So they thought they were going to, it was a business opportunity. They were going to make more money if they kept wildlife. And besides wildlife, you don't, there's less maintenance when it comes to disease. Wildlife just lives on its own like that. Then the other point is the independence in wildlife utilization. As you all know, if you have to use, if you have to utilize wildlife here, like what I mean in here is, especially hunting, it has to follow certain procedures where a quota has to be set, people have to apply, there's a certain period that is allowed for you to utilize. So when it is in private hands, all those are not considered. So this point, I think I mentioned it was also, they felt they were going to have ownership and user rights at any given time they would utilize wildlife. So I'll come to the implementation of the private wildlife estates. The first one is the establishment of private wildlife estate. This one is supported by the legislation. Up to now, we have the Wildlife Act that supports it, and the statutory instruments that are in place that are also supporting their establishment and how they are supposed to be managed. So the second one is also administratively, as DNPW, we have the guidelines on establishing private wildlife estates. So these are quite a lot, but looking at the time that I've been given, I think it's just to suffice to just mention that we have the guidelines on how these private wildlife estates can be established, or steps that are taken for these private wildlife estates to be established. Then the second one is I'll look at the implementation of private wildlife estates. The director, National Parks, is the one mandated or is mandated and responsible for granting the authority to keep wildlife estate, because in the Act it says all wildlife is all wildlife management is supposed to be vested. The management of wildlife is vested in the presidency, but delegated to the Director, National Parks and Wildlife. And that's the person that has the authority to grant it or to transfer it to private individuals. So then when it is transferred, again, the Department of National Parks will still retain the regulatory role in the management of wildlife animals in private estates. The regulatory role that we're talking about is, one, we monitor the population that are in the private hands. We also monitor which species are supposed to go in which area and which size of the area. The other thing is also certain species are not supposed to be taken in the other parts of the country. So then I'll also quickly look at the current status of private wildlife estates. We have, I'll look at the types of private wildlife estates that we have. We have two. We have the closed, which is fenced, then the open, which can be partially fenced or unfenced completely. So for those, then especially on the types of, whether the types of private wildlife estates, whether closed or open, that's where we draw the ownership. So for those that are closed, we put it that they 100% own the animals that are on the property. If at a time when they are fencing their animals that are there, they are normally asked to pay for them so that they fully own them. But for those that are open, in most cases, what is given to them or what is transferred to them are just management rights. The user rights are still controlled by DNPW because they don't own the animals. They haven't like confined the animals into just that property. So when it comes to utilization, DNPW has, he's supposed to set like maybe the quota, how much of the wildlife is supposed to be utilized. Then I also talk about the purposes at the time of establishing these private wildlife estates. People who want to have wildlife for various reasons, but the main reasons that we have are categorized in two. There's the first one, which is commercial. Either they want to be selling meat or live cells of animals, or just for game viewing purposes. So anything that is business oriented will fall under the category of commercial. Then the second one is the ornamental. The ornamental ones, normally these are small areas where they just want wildlife just to beautify their areas or just for aesthetic values. So in most cases, these are the ones that are many at the moment. So when it comes to the number or the current number of active private wildlife estates, we have 133. These are the ones that are active. There are a lot more that are registered, but you find that maybe they have few animals or they are not operating. But the active ones at the moment is 133. Then, of course, in the recent years, we've been recording high demand of game ranching. A lot of people wanting to venture into game ranching, especially for those that have farms in even just small places where they just want to keep few animals around their premises. So also, we've also recorded and increased the collaboration with other partners like WAPAs and many others that want to maybe assist the community game ranches. So this is the short presentation that I had. I know it was going to be a big presentation, but looking at the time that we're given, the 15 minutes, I think I would want to stop there. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Susan. That was Susan Siamundere. For those who have joined us, she is from the Department of National Parks and Wildlife. She is the Senior Conservation Officer. Thanks for that presentation. I would like to encourage those with questions to type them in, and we will try to answer your questions. And we'll have a question and answer session at the end of these presentations. Now I'll call upon the next presenter, Chanda Mwale from WAPAS. Chanda is the Operations Manager for Wildlife Producers Association of Zambia. Chanda, please connect, share your screen, and go ahead with the presentation.
Thank you, Austin. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this webinar series. Thank you, Susan, for a wonderful presentation and overview on what government's perspective and policy position is regarding private wildlife estate. As has been mentioned, my name is Chanda Mwale. I am currently Operations Manager for the Wildlife Producers Association of Zambia. And I will present some of the lessons learned from the private sector's perspective in this industry. I'm just going to start off by introducing who we are as an association. For those of you who do not know, the Wildlife Producers Association of Zambia is a membership-based association. We exist to foster the growth of private and community wildlife estates. And we do this in order to contribute meaningfully to food production, food security, job creation, community development, and also, as you can imagine, conservation. Our core principles as an association is to stimulate the interests of Zambians in sustainable wildlife production. We are also poised to provide technical information and advice to our members. We also work on centralizing industry information and statistics so that our members can make informed decisions. We also share with our members some of the laws, the procedures, and practices of government. So if there's a particular policy that has come on board that relates to our members, we make sure that we consolidate that information and communicate that. We also represent and defend the interests of our members. So we are also into lobbying and advocacy, obviously, to try and help grow the industry. So the status of private wildlife estate, I would like to give a background to how we got to where we are. The association, WPAZ, has been in existence for over 30 years, running mainly through a committee, an executive committee, and with a secretariat in existence, but it was always done by very busy people who were doing this also on a volunteer basis. So the executive were able to get things done, but they also felt the need over the last couple of years, that it would be a good idea to have dedicated full-time staff, which is the secretariat. So with the assistance of USAID in 2020, a secretariat was set up for WPAZ. And this is a secretariat in the sense that full-time staff working and pushing for the agenda for WPAZ. Now, along with the aims and objectives of setting up the secretariat, one of the main things that we needed to do was to update information on the status of the wildlife estate in Zambia. There have been, over time, a number of consultancies that have been done to gather this information, put it together, and produce reports. But the association felt that it would be important to have a systematic way to collect this data, present it, and then also work with partners such as the NPW to make sure we have a clearer picture of where we're at and what we're doing. So we set out to do a number of technical deliverables, one of them being this report. We had two main data sources, primary and a secondary. The primary data was collected by the Secretariat through regional meetings, as well as a questionnaire that WPAZ had set up to ask specific questions around game ranching, size of a ranch, location, animals. We also got information, socioeconomic information, how many people are hired on these premises. Is it a mixed farming operation, or is it purely a game ranch, and so on and so forth. The secondary data source were the annual game ranch return forms. And these are forms that are by law, every private wildlife estate is actually supposed to submit to Department of National Parks. So that was our secondary data source. In our analysis, we included 102 game ranches, and we collated this data and we analyzed it, and we created a number of reports. We were also able in this process to create a database. And my colleague Cholwe, who's speaking after me, will present on the database and how we went about creating the database. But this was sort of our methodology. We had two main sources of data, primary and secondary, and this is how we collected that information. And I'm going to present some of our main findings from there. So our main findings from 102 game ranches in Zambia is that we do have private wildlife estate in 7 out of 10 provinces within the country. As Susan mentioned, Southern Province has one of the highest concentrations, but Lusaka actually is in the lead, mainly due to the ornamental game farms that have been set up that Susan alluded to earlier. Our findings were also that 50%, nearly 50% of the ranches that we analyzed were less than 500 hectares in area, and then 28% were in between 1,000 to 5,000 hectares in size. And the highest concentrations, as I've mentioned, were Lusaka and Southern Province. As Susan alluded to earlier, Southern Province for reasons stated, and Lusaka Province on the ornamental side of things, more and more people are setting up these ornamental game farms. In terms of area, land area that is covered by these 102 ranches, our findings were there's an approximate of 203,807 hectares, holding approximately 58,000 animals. The scientists among us will split these. I mean, when you talk about game animals, you can include the juveniles, or you can only focus on adult animals. So there's that differentiation as well. And there's issues of large animal units and so on and so forth. But the approximate numbers were 58,000 animals on this land area. These sizes range from as small as 3 hectares to 25,000 hectares. The estimated economic value of trade on the ranches through live sales, trophy hunting, game meat, culling, and wildlife byproducts was an estimated $3 million for the year of 2019. I would like to clarify at this point that this was the status of the year 2019, as we were doing the analysis in 2020, because we were obviously using returns from the previous year. So when we look at this figure of $3 million, we are talking about 2019 and not 2020. And then the economic impact as well of poaching is actually quite significant, and that is $1.3 million. So that is the economic impact of poaching on the industry at large. And our findings were also that approximately 103,000 kilograms of legally harvested game meat was put on the market. So some of the lessons that we learned going through this process, trying to put together this status, trying to update industry information, and speaking to some of our members through their experiences. Some of the main threats to the growth of this industry are regulatory ambiguities, over-regulation, poaching, as has been highlighted, the illegal wildlife trade, and the lack of ownership. And in terms of ownership and the lack of ownership, Susan did mention that the PWEs are granted ownership, but the actual practice is that every year, our members or anybody who owns a private wildlife estate has to renew their ownership. And this speaks to issues of regulation, and that change in ownership is what we believe as PWE could actually unlock the industry and help it grow. Poaching is also a big issue. We've been working on security with other institutions as well as DNPW, but this is also a very, very, very big issue within the industry. Our findings were also that there needs to be a systematic and independent review of the industry. And this needs to capture the ecological as well as economic contribution of the industry. We heard it being alluded to in the previous presentation that the impetus from government was on the ecological side. And then from the private sector, there was also the economic side. So we need to find a way to review these in tandem. And make sure that we can systematically look at this industry and measure whether it is growing or shrinking and have some figures to back that up. We also, through this process, one of the key recommendations that we need a proper inventory of the game farms and ranches. And when I say we, this is not excluding the Department of National Parks because they are the mandate holders. So this is something that would be required for the industry. Ideally, I think even be done by Department of National Parks to do a survey, and not a desktop survey, but a proper survey across the country so that they have a clear picture of who is where doing what. We also found out that the definition of wildlife estates is still a little bit ambiguous, and the understanding of people in the industry is ambiguous. So there's need for clarity. People really need to understand, as Susan broke it down, there's closed and open, and we all need to understand what that means and what applies where. And also our findings were that WPAZ is actually able to positively contribute to capacity building of community and tertiary students. So there's a lot of capacity within the association, members who've been doing game ranching for decades here in Zambia, and there is scope to translate that into useful capacity building beyond industry members and spreading that out to community game ranches, but also to tertiary education, and with hopes of setting up an internship program in the future. WPAZ really wants to work in that space and help grow the industry. So I'll stop there for now, and I'll be able or available any questions after. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chanda, for giving us a very nice presentation, breaking it down from the industry point of view. We really appreciate. Those with questions for Chanda, you can type them in the chat box. She'll be able to respond to your questions, or you can wait for the question and answer session where you can interact with any of the presenters. This time we'll be moving to the next presenter. The next presenter is Cholwe Ruwamya, and she's taking it up from where Chanda left. Chanda mentioned the database for Wildlife Producers Association. Cholwe will give us the details that the database has. Cholwe, please, could you share your screen and make your presentation? Cholwe, could you unmute yourself? We can't hear you.
Right.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can, and put the presenter mode so that you are able to see the presentation. Okay. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Alston. My name is Cholwe Ruwamya from Wildlife Producers Association of Zambia. I'm a community and engagement officer. So I'm going to take through the presentation of the WPAZ Access database that was developed. So the Access database, basically, it's a management tool that was developed by WPAZ to provide information on economic assessment, stocking assessment, and also it to be a game ranch management database on private and community wildlife estate in Zambia. So like Chanda mentioned, for the database, we also use the annual game return from each game ranch and also the questionnaire that was developed by WPAZ. So these tools were used to analyze various estimations. Like I mentioned, the stocking assessment and the economic assessment. Then the information that is derived from the database and including the questionnaire give us a picture how issues such as poaching can affect the industry. For example, if a game ranch in that particular year had experienced a lot of poaching, it can affect to the meat production that the game ranch is supposed to produce at the end of the year. So it sort of gives us say, okay, this need of game ranchers to pay attention to security and to address poaching as the BPAZ and also as the Department of National Park and Wildlife. Also, the information derived from the database plays a key role in decision-making by the government. Like Chanda mentioned, currently the private wildlife estate is not clear. So there's need for ownership because it shows that game ranching can contribute to the food industry, to conservation, job creation. So for it to thrive, there's need for government to make clear laws so that it can encourage more Zambians and more people to venture in the industry. The Access database can produce various information. For example, it can produce game ranch details, opening balance and retains, benchmarks, and KPI reports. Then on the game ranch details, this section shows entered data from the private and community wildlife estate. So the section under this game ranch details was generated from the questionnaire that WPAZ developed. So some of the information that is entered there is the type of wildlife estate. Is it a game farm? Is it a game ranch? Permits, what sort of permits they have, location, where is it found, environmental features such as habitat, game animal stocks and stocking rates. Employees, it gives us picture how many employees are in that particular private wildlife estate. It also has a section where it shows challenges. Here, a game rancher is able to write down what challenges they face, and also recommendations, a recommendation that a game rancher would give to the BPAZ or to Department of National Parks and Wildlife to make the industry a very successful industry that can contribute to the growth. Then the opening balance and returns. So this session, the information from here is generated from the annual game return from DNPW. So on this return, you have the opening balance, where male, females, and juveniles information is entered, additions such as number of births in that year, how many animals were imported. Then you have subtractions such as culling, poaching, death. Then I must mention that the opening balance, as we're doing the development of the database, the opening balance is entered as 1st December of the previous year. Then the closing stock for a particular year becomes the opening stock for the next year. For example, if the closing stock for 2019 is 300,000, the numbers of animals, that will be the opening stock for 2020. So that's how the database is made. Then we have benchmarks and KPI reports. So this shows a comparative key performance indicators for game ranch industry. So it includes the following. So this screenshot was generated from the database. So from here, you can see that it shows year, 2018 and 2019. Then it also shows how many how many ranches were sampled. So you can see from 2018 to 2019, 2018, we had 109 game farms, game ranches. Then in 2019, we had 103. Can also see the difference here on the total areas in hectares. You can see that in 2019, the number reduced due to the number of game ranches that were sampled. What are some of the lessons that we learned and recommendations? So when we're entering the data, we figured that different game ranches use different annual returns. So we encourage more private wildlife estates to use the recommended DNPW game return. This, and also we encourage them to submit their annual returns on time. Another lesson that was learned is that the annual returns have to be of good quality. As the game ranchers that enter in this information, they have to make sure that the numbers are coordinating. This will help in having the database that has got accurate information. And also, like I mentioned, linked to the good quality, WPAZ developed a members toolkit. This toolkit helps to improve the accuracy of the DNPW reform and have accuracy in the data. Then the other one, the database needs to incorporate up-to-date market values. So it is really important as we are entering the information that the market values that are in the database are up to date, 2018, 2019, 2020. So it gives us a clear picture of how the industry is developing. Then the accuracy of the database is increased with more data annual return entries. So the more we have data, the more we have annual returns, it helps us to have an increase in the database analysis. Then there's need of continuation of updating the database. This database, it will help us understand the industry. So if we continue to update it. It will avoid issues of, for example, if someone wants to do a status report, they'll maybe use different methodology, which will be very hard to analyze maybe what we've done or what has been done before. So it needs to continue so that we can have a clear industry and something that is of standard. I end my presentation for the PowerPoint, then I'm going to just show you a snapshot of the database, how it looks, and some of the things that it can generate. Okay, so this is the database. As you can see, it has different things that it can able to generate. So our main focus today is going to be on reports by branch and report benchmarks and KPIs. I need to mention that this database is treated as confidential, and for this demonstration, consent was given by Kushia Farms to use the farm as a demonstration. So here I'm going to enter Kushia 2019. As you can see, the DMPW, so the information that is entered, it's able to extract this this DMPW form. Then from here, you can see species here, then the opening balance for that previous year, which is 2019. Then here it shows the additions that were made during that year, number of births. Then here subtractions, it can show subtraction that can be made, live sales, game meat cropping, trophy hunting, game management killing, how many were poached, how many died. Then at the end is able to make calculations. Then I'll go to the benchmark here. Like in the PowerPoint presentation, so this is the benchmark that the database is able to produce. So from each game ranch, everything is analyzed and it gives us this information. So for 2018, we had entered 109 annual returns. Then for 2019, we had entered 103 annual returns. Then you can see the total size in hectares. Then you can also have an estimation of how many total kg legal agreement was produced in 2019 and in 2018. So this gives us a picture of how, like I mentioned, issues of poaching can affect the industry, issues of disease, how can it affect the industry? So if there's a lot of disease, mean that there'll be a lot of game management killing that can have an impact on your business. Poaching can also have an impact on your business. And also the registered game annual returns, it would give us a clear picture of how many game ranches do we have in here. Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? What is making it to increase or decrease? And also help DMPW to, like I mentioned, policy issues, and also us as WPSZ, the need of us to grow the membership and bring more people on board to venture into the wildlife industry. I end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jorwe, for your presentation and for demonstrating how the database works, and for giving us the insights on how information can be gathered together and how people can be actually make decisions about it. I think your presentation really stimulates discussions and dialogue moving forward. For now, I will invite Ian Robinson to share with us the practical knowledge and experiences in private wildlife estate. Ian, please share your screen and go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody, ladies and gentlemen. I just asked that Chanda is going to share the screen on my behalf and move along with me. And just in advance, apologies for any duplications on pictures on this presentation. The Secretariat did put it from my head onto paper. I didn't have the time to do it. So as we go forward, again, welcome. This is just a brief kind of synopsis of what we do on a private wildlife estate, and I'll try and elaborate on as many of these points as possible. Thanks, Chanda. Could you go to the next one? Okay, so game ranching in Zambia. So game ranching has a great potential with the right policy support and business environment. It can positively contribute to food security, job creation, community development, and conservation. I think Chanda touched on this. This is the highlight of what we see game ranching as a potential within the country. And it's something that on Kushia specifically, as I talk on that topic, it opens up huge opportunity, as we'll see in the coming slide. So talking about Kushia, we're situated in the southern province here in Zambia, where you see there's almost 50% of the game farms. We're a mixed farming practice. We were established game in 2002. We were predominantly a dairy farm by then. Since our establishment of game, we entered into sugarcane farming. And so our beef and game coincide together on the same property. And our cropping operation goes in between the same. Currently on the property, we have 14 different species, which are all just antelope, an approximated population of 1,200 head of game. The game ranch is roughly 3,000 hectares big, and we've got 12 permanent scouts employed, which is a day and night patrol of our secured boundary fence, which I haven't mentioned earlier, but for interest's sake, is anything from 2.8 to 3.5 meters tall. Thanks, Jenna. Okay, how Kushia runs. So the main source of income for Kushia game farm, that is split up into resident hunting, and this is mainly for meat and the game meat industry. And then there's a small income that comes in from safari hunting, where international clients will come in as an add-on to their concession GMA hunts and come and pick species off game farms in which they would like to trophy collect various species. On this, we're fortunate in Zambia to have indigenous species such as Crawshay's waterbuck, your puku, your kafui lechwe, black lechwe, and others that draw these safari hunters to game farms to harvest these animals. Management of the game is done mainly to maintain an offtake of around 250 to 300 animals per year. We're looking at an average breeding rate across species of about 30%. It goes as high as impala, around 85%, to possibly as low as some of your select species like hartebeest, etc., of about 20% for argument's sake. So that gives you just a cross section. The game does undergo from time to time supplementary feeding because we're running a confined space. Your select animals, mainly eland and sable, will require supplementary feeding during the dry parts of the year as they're predominantly browsers, and your browse struggles during that time. Game farm, our game farm is definitely a secondary and not a primary source of income. We developed the game farm as a conservation sort of a love for conservation concept, and it's become a secondary income for us as we've gone along. The value addition we do from here, we push certain legal game meat through the cafe. We utilize the skins for sale. Legal game meat is a key part of running the business, and that's because that is your bread and butter of a game farm that pays your week-to-week or month-to-month bills, and that's where we see as your key. Yeah, so 20 years later we sit, and the game farm has become 2/3 of our income in comparison to what beef used to give us. So it's overtaken beef, and it now gives us 2/3 more than our beef herd currently gives us. To give you an idea, the beef herd is only 350 animals, and that's sustainable for the size property we have and the environment we have. Thanks, Jonah. Okay, so I think leverage and opportunities. I think what I mean by here is, Kushia has maximized opportunities with the value chain, which is the game meat and the resin hunting and the safari hunting for that matter. We used earlier to develop the game farm, we used our cattle as the startup capital for the game. So we basically sold cattle year on year and replaced it with game animals. I see this as a very pertinent point of how you can develop a game farm within your own resources and not be looking for massive amounts of money to begin. What I didn't mention earlier, which is pertinent to this, is we actually set up this game farm as a security aspect and started putting game in. So we lost in excess of 40 cattle in a season from cattle rustling. We sold further cattle, put the fence up, and then started putting the game in as we love to see game and have been in the conservation arena for a long time. And now finally it's come into an actual payback business. Diversification and value is a key points to help optimize production of the game stock. So I think you need to look into all options. It's extremely difficult to just look at one avenue, i.e. just game meat or just safari hunting or just photographic. You need to look into this, the diversification and value adding to get the most out of your game farm. Comparisons, and these are just very few of the many there are. Then we're talking about in the sort of past years of when we began game farming, the interest in the industry was very limited. Mostly was done through conservation objectives, which I mentioned. We all wanted to conserve wildlife and we enjoyed basically viewing it just for ourselves. The mid-2000s, huge interest came in to game farming, and poaching basically decimated most of those opportunities going forward. So that really hampered the keenness for people to start game farming and get involved in game farming, just because of the immense poaching pressure that was there at the time. At that time, there were fewer suppliers of specialist services like capture, professional harvesting, game feed companies, security companies, the list can go on. There was basically, it was a pioneering part or time at that stage, and very few ornamental game ranches existed. So your market for live game was restricted between the very few game farms that existed. When you look at the picture now, there's a very clear value to game and a business case. So game farming has become something where the markets are fully open. There is a great value in live animals, trophy animals and meat animals, so you can trade in either. And obviously on the photographic side, which we don't do, but is done throughout the country. The Legal Game Meat campaign has brought about this demand, and we see more and more people interested in legal game meat, right through to the hotels, and this gives us a great advantage for development and expansion. International markets for your safari hunting has improved. As game farms have shown, they can offer a wide variety of free-range animals in that stage in larger areas. It's becoming increasingly popular for international clients to come and visit Zambia to select our endemic species in particular. And there is an increased number now of specialist service providers. There's at least 4 capture companies throughout the country. You're seeing, like I mentioned, bigger markets, a lot more value chains opening, like butcheries and processing areas, where you've got a lot more choice for what you have to offer. So this allows you basically to optimize production. And currently, we have grown it such that it's not too difficult now to sell any of your game off your property. And then also what's topped this off, I think is important, is we have a partnership through the WPAZ, with government, which is the Veterinary Department and Department of National Parks. And I think we see a clear desire to change policy to support the industry. So this in itself is encouraging game farmers to develop and get into game farming. And that's how you've seen on Susan's presentation of the increase of interest in game farming. Thanks, Janet. Okay, lessons learned, policy recommendations. I think I mentioned earlier, diversification is key. Game ranching in its current form cannot be a primary source of income in terms of my operation. So it's a restricted area and a mixed farming practice, or other land uses, put it that way. Whereas, you know, in other cases, it can be depending on game numbers and size of sort of area. Game ranching, to me, is a complementary land use and helps the arid areas and attracts a buffer against climate shocks. So to give you an idea, in the last 2 years, we experienced some extreme droughts, of which we inherited basically a terrible production in both crops and livestock, whereas my game farm actually kept us afloat and produced just the same as it did in all the other years. So that is encouraging when it comes to resilience against climate change. Southern Province, as you see, is well suited for this because of the low rainfall, and this is key to utilize those areas that don't necessarily work for cropping. The other thing is for us, game farming requires expert and technical knowledge. I think if we're going to go into game farming, for us, we came from a safari guide background, and our love for nature and the outdoors has seen us grow experience and knowledge. And as we've grown as a game farm, so we've learned lessons ourselves and learned from our neighbors and friends who have gone into the same. And this has allowed us to build up a large knowledge of how to look after game. Whilst it is something that does roam free, it does require management because you now are constricting it to a fenced area. The regulatory and policy environment could be a bit more streamlined to support the growth of this wildlife economy. I think Susan and Chanda mentioned a few points here where it talks about the alignment of the Wildlife Act and the SIs and policy to actually talk to game farming. Game farming being a new thing is not present in any of the old legislation and needs to be included there under the private wildlife estates. And so we need this to streamline to allow us to trade, as there are confusions in the industry for us when you come to trade where game farming in the Veterinary Act sits under livestock, and in the Wildlife Act, it also sits in the Wildlife Act with DNPW. So these things need to be streamlined to allow us to go forward with that. So we are working within the means, and I must say the support from the Veterinary Department and National Parks has been great, allowing us to trade a lot more seamlessly in the last 3 years than in the past. And this has allowed us to try and utilize as much as we can. The part of full ownership of game by landowners will revolutionize the industry. I think to attract investment into this area, certainly ourselves, there is this doubt surrounding game farming. If you don't have outright ownership of what you are investing in, game farming is a huge investment. To us, it took 10 years to date to pay back our investment with the volume of game and even our own income on that stage. So it is something that needs to be looked at. Business and science needs to go hand in hand. I think you've got to run it as a business. At the same time, you've got to know what you're doing. On our part, we analyze our game counts, breeding rates, various quotas that we set ourselves to become sustainable within Kushia farms. And we feel that's terribly important for you to be able to manage and have a continuous income throughout the year. Private wildlife estates, a lot can contribute to community natural resource management in business and management. So So the private wildlife estates can contribute towards this immensely, and I can elaborate on it a bit later. More specialized services personnel needs to get involved in the industry so we can actually make harvesting effective. So what I mean by that is that the industry is growing and there are immense business opportunities that can come to us as a game farm, i.e. professional harvesting, game management services, and the likes that can further educate us how to look better after our game and get more production out of it. When you look at the database of which Cholwe presented, that gives you a clear indication and will be an incredible management tool for us as a game farm to see exactly where we are and our stocking rates, etc. So we can know what species are struggling, what are doing well, what are the best for meat production, what are the best for trophy production. So that should give us a much better idea. Thanks, Chanda. Okay, so apologies for the duplication in picture, but I think that's the end of my presentation, and thanks very much for giving me the time. Like I said, that is in a nutshell, so I welcome any questions later of anything anybody would like to know. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ian. You have given us a lot actually in this compressed presentation. We are really grateful, and I think you have really helped us to understand the details on what goes on in the game ranch. And I think it's an opportunity for us to begin to talk about it. Ladies and gentlemen, at this point in time, we have exhausted all the presentations we had lined up today, and it's time now for us to interact. It's a session now for question and answer, and I'll encourage you to ask questions so that the presenters can give you a response. So who wants to go first? You can raise your hand, press the raise hand icon so that I can recognize you and give you space to ask a question or to comment on the presentations. Anyone?
If I could just make a comment, I think there are a lot of comments in the chat box. Maybe you could guide us through and address that to the panelists one by one, and then we can start with those maybe.
Okay, thanks very much, Ian. We have some questions and some of them, we have some responses that have been typed in, but we have a question from anonymous attendee is asking, is there any verification done on the WPAZ database? He wants to know whether there is verification done. I don't know who wants to take it, whether it's Cholwe or Chanda. I can see Chanda has already provided a response. Chanda, could you just shed more light on that?
Hi, thank you.
Cholwe, actually. Yeah.
Oh, Cholwe?
Yes, Cholwe can.
I can start and then Cholwe can finish.
Please go ahead.
Anonymous attendee.
Yes.
We don't know why you're choosing to be anonymous. But I'm not sure I understand what you mean by verification done on the database. Do you mean triangulation, or whether the figures were verified with DNPW against? I'm not 100% sure what you mean, but what I can say though is that the database is a work in progress. We are using and basing any data or information that is going into it on two things: the existing annual return forms, which are submitted to Department of National Parks and Wildlife, and then the questionnaire, which we created as WPAZ to help us create industry information. So for example, maybe if I give an example of kilograms of game meat that were sold, it's an estimate, but it's an estimate based upon what percentage of a carcass that is, and this is scientifically rigorous, so what percentage of a carcass that has been culled for meat will actually make it onto the table. So for example, if it's 55%, we know that for an impala, 55% of its weight would then produce X kilograms. And that's the number that we have included in the formulas of the database to then churn those numbers. I'll stop there for now. I think that's how I understood the question, but yeah, it was a bit, it wasn't clear enough from my end. Maybe Chobe can step in now.
Choro, do you want to add to what Chanda has provided? You can go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Like Chanda has mentioned, I also found it not unclear, but I have to mention that the database, we had a meeting with DNPW, so it's not something that is just on our end. DNPW has information about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Chanda, there is one, I think it's a space, yeah, it is directed to you from Mwape Mumbi. And could you cite any impediments, solutions to growing local indigenous ownership? Which findings in your report as lacking? I don't know whether you're able to understand this. Yeah. Could you cite any impediment solutions to growing local indigenous ownership? So it's local / indigenous ownership. Which findings in your report maybe you wanted to say are lacking? I think something like that.
Thanks, Austin. If Mwape Mumbi is still on the webinar, I'd ask if they could please elaborate on their question, so that I understand what they're saying and what they're asking, specifically what they're asking.
Mwape, please make it clear to the presenters so that they can give you a well-informed response. Okay, maybe we'll move to another one. Maybe you come in later. The other one is directed to Ian. And it's coming from your presentation. 30% breeding is quite high. What is the overall mortality rate if you do not consider legal hunting? Yeah, somewhere there. So the issue is about 30%.
Sorry to jump in late. The clarification about my question, I don't know where you can hear me clearly.
Yes, so Ian, you just wait. Let's give Mwape a chance to clarify the question. Please go ahead.
There's a citation in the association's report that there's a need to grow ownership. So that's the ownership that I was curious to know. Since it's been cited as lacking, what then, if the report has been able to identify, could be the proposed solutions to the identified impediments to growing that lacking ownership? And I'm assuming it's maybe local ownership, indigenous, etc. ownership. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope, Chanda, you were able to get to us a little bit, not very clear, but from your presentation, you talked about ownership, which is ownership of animals. So what solutions are you providing? I think now it's made it a bit clear. Go ahead and make a response.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Mumbi. I think it would be important for me to clarify that on the ownership perspective and what we meant in the presentation. The first thing being that when we speak about ownership, we're talking about the regulation. So within the legislation as it is now, the ownership of all game animals in the country is vested in the Republican president. Whether this is on a farm, on a ranch, it is vested in the president. We do have user rights on game ranches. And every year there's a certificate of ownership that you can renew and you can utilize the game. But for example, there are other countries within the region, for example, South Africa, where you are given partial ownership of full user rights for at least 3 years. And this allows for investment in the industry. As Ian alluded to, it's an expensive industry. It's not cheap to get into game ranching. Setting up the fencing alone will set you back a couple of $100,000, okay? So in order to get more people to happily invest in this, ownership will create security on the side of the investors. Because the way it is currently in the legislation, there is some insecurity that lies there. That's the first one. Then the second one, in terms of indigenous ownership, I would say that there is a growing number of indigenous Zambians who are interested in the game ranching industry. It has opened up, and even our report findings suggest that it is changing. So there is indigenous ownership. And in terms of legislative impediments, I've already cited the ambiguity in the law, and our proposal at WPAZ is for there to be a very clear statutory instrument that supports the growth of this industry, which will encourage ownership across the board. Thank you.
Thank you very much for clarifying that. And we have some more questions from Anonymous attendee. Are you on? Perhaps you can ask all the questions now that it's time to interact and we get everything from you. He has already posted here. In addition to what Ian must answer now, he's also asking all panelists, so even including Ian, you can have one, you can make a response to this. Any instances of where community forest management areas are also operating as game ranches? And there's another question also to all panelists, considering that habitat loss and deforestation is a major threat to game management areas and wildlife in general, do you see game ranching as an option in these vast shared protected areas? Does the policy allow? So Ian, you can go first, and I really want Susan to touch the issue of whether the policy allows.
Okay, thanks very much. So if I could understand that question, I'll comment against it. So the 30% breeding rate, yes, it is high because of the supplementary feeding. I would say would contribute towards that. The overall mortality. So what would happen? I don't think you can take a percentage to it, but over time, if you did not consider legal hunting, your breeding rates due to overpopulation would drop. Your mortalities due to competition would then increase, and your population would remain stagnant to basically providing for those animals that the environment can actually hold. So what you've got to look at is the realistic population, and your game animals will tell you just simply on condition. So if you do not allow legal offtake, your numbers would just decline over time, and they would never be able to grow. So the offtake also, if I had to mention, keeps your animals young, fit, and reproducing, because you only ever take off those that are not needed, excess males and older females. So therefore you control your population to a young age, and the reproduction rate increases. So I could say due to the supplementary feeding and to keeping young animals in your herds and active breeding males, etc., it would keep your breeding rates high as that. And that's just an estimate. It could even be higher from that. If I could go on to the next question slightly, the panelists are asking about the community forest management areas. So far, none of those community forest management areas are operating as a game farm as such. There is a lot of interest through the association, and I talk of this as the chairman of the association, and Chanda can elaborate. There is a huge amount of interest to convert these areas to having game as one of the income sources for the community forest areas. And I think this is a great initiative, just as we talked about diversification. So if I could leave it at there, thank you.
Thank you very much. Chanda, you want to add?
Austin, can I go?
Please go. Susan.
Yes,
go ahead.
I want to just make a clarification when it comes to ownership of wildlife on private wildlife estates. The Act states that all wildlife in Zambia is vested in the presidency, but the management function is given to the Department of National Parks and Wildlife. I mentioned that the Director National Parks further transfers this ownership to individuals that have shown interest in keeping wildlife. And this works on those, for those that have fenced their areas, they retain the 100% of ownership of those animals on their properties. And that's why I mentioned that for those that maybe fenced areas that had wildlife, we had to sell them because initially, whether they were on their properties before they are fenced, they belong to the state. So for those that purchased them, they own them 100%. So for those that are into open areas, because animals are moving from one, they have not like confined their movements. So those animals are still regarded as state animals. But what the director would do, or what would have done, is just transferring the management rights, which is either buying animals, restocking that area, and ensuring that animals, the numbers of animals grow in that area. So I wanted just to make sure that this ownership thing is clarified. For those that are fenced, like Ian, he owns the animals 100%. He can sell, he can do whatever he feels like doing. And even us, when we regulate, there are just other things that we look at. Is it the reasons why we want them to look at issues of the certificate of ownership, why we want them the certificate of ownership to be renewed every year, is to ensure that we check what has happened to the population. Has he added another species? Because I understand from the other people, they think that maybe that is too much of the permits. But what I want to make you understand is that that is an important permit that you need yearly. Because you can imagine if you bought 2 species this year, what will happen if you want something that is just one-off? What will happen if you buy 2 more other species? How are we going to add those animals to your certificate of ownership? So I wanted just to clarify so that the ownership thing issue is clarified. The
Thank
people
you very
who
much. Yeah.
Yes. So I wanted just to clarify the ownership for business. The people that are fenced, they own the animals, except I know there are other species where we have issues, those that we are saying that they are difficult to be confined in the area. These are the monkeys and maybe birds that will fly in and out. Those are the ones where we still thinking that maybe we need to deliberate on that so that we can come to an understanding, because we understand that for the birds or for those animals to get to those properties, like Ian has said, that they do supplementary feed. So we see that the farmer is also putting in efforts to ensure that either they attract those animals and birds or something like that, so that we meet halfway into that.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan, for making clarifications. I think it's how we interpret the act, because perhaps Chanda's point of view is if you have to renew the ownership, and if you don't renew by legal implication, the ownership goes back to the president, so you lose if you don't. And that's why she says if you, the ownership issue is like, has to be done every year. Thanks for the clarification. Let me give chance to Royd to speak. After Royd, I'll give chance to Rolf Shenton, and then you have Richard to speak, and Angel, in that order. So let's give chance to Royd to make a contribution.
Hi, thanks, Alston. I was almost forgetting what I wanted to
sorry.
get a clarification on. Well, I think this is to all the panelists. It's the question of community participation. Hello, you can get me?
Yes, please go ahead. You're
Hello?
loud and clear. Go ahead.
Are you able to get me now?
Yes, we are getting you loud and clear. Go ahead.
Austin?
Yes, Vinya, I can hear you.
Hello? Okay, thank you. Well, I wanted to touch on the issue of... okay, thank you. The issue of how best we can encourage our local communities. Yeah, I wanted to touch on issues on how best we can encourage our local communities to begin to own or to begin to be participants in all this story around the community game ranch management. Because one of the things I see as a major impediment is the need to fence. If you don't fence, then you have less ownership of the animals on that particular land. If you fence, then you have a greater ownership. But then the fencing comes along with the costs that are related to that. So what it basically essentially means is that the communities can only do it if there is sufficient resources, either within that particular community or somebody else comes, which is basically becomes a project. But then you see that in an event where this particular community does not have external support, even if they are endowed with a lot of game around them, they will just be the bystanders of all this idea of how people can develop these areas with the resources that are endowed with. The question I have, particularly to the Department of DPNW, how can we basically reposition the legal framework as well as the policy environment to ensure that communities can, with less impediment and less costs, set up their own community game ranches?
Thank you very much, Roy. I don't know whether it's only me. We are really in slow motion, but I think I got your concern. How can we mobilize the communities to participate in game ranching, and how can the cost be reduced to accommodate that? This is best answered by Susan. But before I allow Susan to come in to answer this, let me get Shenton to make a contribution. Prof. Shenton.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Loud and clear, please. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's something that we think about a lot. The risk of fencing a property, of confining animals in any property, whether they be livestock or wildlife, is that they stop moving and they start really degrading the habitat. And I'm sure that most game ranchers have found this. There's that risk. So you've got to find some way of moving them. In nature, there would be predators to keep them moving. And the basis of all Alan Savory's work and holistic management is really using livestock to keep the animals moving, or herding, or to keep animals moving so that they give a chance for vegetation to regrow and for disease cycles to break. So we do that in Mpancha. We have cattle, goats, and sheep, and we run them in the communal area. We've now got everybody's animals together, and we're seeing regenerative effects. So we get more and more grass every year because we hammer it and then we move on. And we've also not dipped we dip maybe 3 times a year at the most, because we're breaking the cycles of disease. And this is just mimicking natural processes. So really one of the challenges of all fence properties will be increasing disease, controlling disease buildup, and also, you know, making sure that you don't have enough, that you don't have degrading habitat, so that the carrying capacity goes down. Now, having said that, what Namibia did for communities, and this answers the previous question, or speaks to the previous question a little bit, is not discuss the ownership. Is let me just leave fenced properties aside, but if we want to see wildlife business expand in Zambia, it is impossible to see how we're going to fence hundreds of properties around the country at vast expense. And it's not even useful. So if we do this and we say, okay, we give people 100% user rights or user rights when animals are on their property, then the whole incentive goes towards improving or regenerating the habitat, making it more attractive to attract wildlife from the next community. And that's really what has happened. And then you don't get fenced properties. You have no need to fence, because when the animals are in your area, you can use them. So you can hunt them or use them for tourism or whatever. And this model has really led to a very rapid expansion of the wildlife estate in Namibia. And I would urge government to think about this, that the ownership stays with the state. There's no problem with that. But we have to give communities the incentives and the tools to really utilize the wildlife that they've attracted. And if we don't use livestock, it will be very difficult to improve the habitat. So again, I would urge national parks to really look at the effects that can be done, the regenerative effect of managing livestock properly, holistically, within any habitat, to improve the habitat to attract the wildlife. And this would really speak to a big opportunity to expand, to see this wildlife expanding into communities who already have livestock. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rolf. And before the panelists react to this, let me bring in Richard in case he forgets the point, just like Roy almost did. So, Richard, please. Yes.
Thanks.
Richard, please unmute Richard so that he can make a contribution.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Loud and clear, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Austin. Some really good questions there. First, can I just say thanks to Susan for her clarification. It was a very important clarification. It's quite clear that the issue of ownership has been dealt with by DNPW within prevailing legislation as best they can, and user rights or the ability to use wildlife on private wildlife estates has been facilitated by the work of DNPW. The issue with the ownership, though, is not so much really what good work DNPW has done on this. It's a question of competing interests for wildlife. If the cost or the process of ownership of wildlife ownership is higher than the process or the cost of normal domestic livestock ownership, then wildlife will not compete as effectively with normal livestock. Why should we want it to compete more effectively? The reason is simple, that in certain circumstances, environmental circumstances, and particularly with the climate resilience of the areas where wildlife really does flourish, we would like to see wildlife utilization, even if it's mixed with domestic livestock. We would like to see that becoming the preferred land use option. But people are not going to opt for wildlife, even if it is the best form of land use, if there is a cost in terms of the process or even the financial cost of getting the ownership of wildlife. So yes, Susan's quite right with that. But I think when you couch it in the way I've put it, you can see. I hope Susan can. She may wish to come back to me on this issue and disagree with me, but you can see that there is a challenge to the ownership of wildlife for the private wildlife estates. Now, if you transfer the question to the other questioner about the communities, the biggest impediment to community development of community wildlife management is really the fencing issue, because that's also related to ownership. Now, I agree with what Rolf has said. If ownership of wildlife in open areas, community areas, that is, was left in the state, but they were given unfettered user rights to that resource, then I would agree with Rolf. But if you fence it, then you could possibly get more direct ownership rights, but the cost of fencing and the cost of managing for communities to manage game ranches within a fence in extensive, which is large areas, in open areas, is the prohibitive factor. So I hope I've put those two factors together in a way that makes sense. Look at it from the point of view of private wildlife estates, look at it from the point of view of community wildlife estates. And we can see where the impediments are. It's not that there aren't user rights, and in certain circumstances, the user rights through government will work. In other circumstances, the cost or the process of ownership for the private sector does not allow them to compete with other forms of livestock. And those are where the problems are. Thanks very much, Alston. I hope that's a contribution that stimulates some discussion.
Thank you very much, Richard. And just to mention that we have another webinar next week, next Thursday, same time, where we'll focus primarily on community game ranching. So we tried to draw a line, a very thin line between private wildlife estates, which is more commercial for private people, and then the community one, which is basically how you can organize the communities and then how they can participate. We'll have presenters who share the ideas, their experiences in trying to mobilize the communities to participate in community game ranching. But thank you very much for bringing that. Quite sorry that Susan has exited the meeting. We really wanted her to answer to your question, Richard, and I can see Loveness has also given questions which are supposed to go to Susan, but hopefully there is still someone who can help us with the issues on the that have been raised, where the government is supposed to make a response. Angel, do you still want to speak? I can see that you had indicated, and then do you still want to speak, Angel? I want to give chance now to the panelists to respond to Royd and Rolf and also Richard. Angel, are you there? Okay, so let me push it back to the panelists, and we have a number of issues that have been raised where you need to respond to. Who wants to go first? There is an issue that Professor Vinya actually has brought, how to mobilize the communities, but we'll have more details next week as I indicated. But also he talks about the issue of reducing the cost of managing wildlife, private wildlife estates, the issue of fencing, which is also shared with the other participants, the concern that is shared by other participants. Susan is out, who can make a response? Chanda, you want to say something? Or
Hi,
do we
Austin.
have? Yes, go ahead.
I want to understand what exactly the question is, how we can bring down the cost of fencing.
All right, so the context in which the question has been asked, the first concern is that what is pushing up the cost of managing or establishing game ranches is the condition of fencing. How is this going to be addressed? And then the other part of the question is, how do you mobilize the local communities to participate in game ranching? a very similar question is what Loveness has asked, whether government has left this only to the private sector or government is involved with this. I think those who are participating in this know that government has no game ranch. So this is a simple question to answer.
Chanda,
yeah, so Chanda, you can take it. Say again?
Yeah, I think Ian can start and then I can chat on the community side.
Ian, go first and then Chanda.
Okay, thanks very much. So I think all the questions are kind of leading to the same thing. So when we're talking about the sort of education piece Rolf had given us, we've got to view these things as totally separate entities. So private wildlife estates, when we talk about game farms, are normally in commercial areas where a game is used as a secondary income. It's closer to town where the areas might be smaller, so you have to confine the game. When we talk about community conservancies or community game farms, open areas adjacent to your GMAs, then it's totally different. So we have done a lot of work as the Wildlife Producers Association to figure out what is the best way forward. When we talk about fencing, yes, we look at it being completely impractical. You have an example of Mushingashi Conservancy where they've done a huge amount of work. They've got 30,000 hectares, but they're open to the park and they're struggling with the ownership aspect. So just as Rolf mentioned, there needs to be further look into this user rights of those animals. So where the community, where they apply, you've got to remember in some areas there is no community, some areas there are. But we talk specifically about the open areas or adjacent to wildlife areas where you can have part ownership, which would be through government, communities, and the investor who's come in there. And I think this is where we've all been leading to, and we're looking in the upcoming legislation to include this. Susan evaluated on it a little bit. So as communities, I think what we can do more is conserve the areas adjacent to the protected areas, look after the area, make sure there's enough habitat, make sure that animals are passing freely in and out of there. And then we can come, when this concept comes about, we can then apply to government and look at the part ownership and utilization of the same animals of which you'll be given a quota to utilize. It's still got to be regulated by national parks. So I think Richard also elaborated on a similar thing. There are crossover things when we come back to private wildlife estates and ownership. I think one of the other questions was, I saw there was, what do you mean by over-regulation of the same? So now I'm speaking specifically for private wildlife estates and areas. You're talking about a huge cost to basically utilize something that we've just been told we own 100%. So I'll give you various examples. We have quotas issued to you for birds and or cats if you'd like to harvest on your area. You've got a permission to sell game meat, permit to capture, renewals every year, certificate of ownership, permission to keep animals in captivity, capture permission, which in some cases takes up to 3 weeks to a month to get approved, veterinary permits when you move from there. So the regulation is immense. If you translate that back to cattle, it's nowhere close. And the cost related to it and the inconvenience related to it means it's not really free trade of something you own. So I think I've kind of gone through most. And if I could just end by saying, you know, certainly as the association, we would like to see the growth in general of game and game management throughout the country. And anything that stands in that way, we need to debate and get to the fast track of how we can best utilize animals for the good of the people and those that invest into it. So I think I could probably leave it at that, and hopefully I've answered some of the queries.
Thank you very much. Chanda.
Hi, I don't think there's much else that can be said after Ian, because I think he elaborated on most of it. But
okay.
on the community engagement, it is linked to the points that have been raised around policy direction. The government has been very clear what their policy direction is. There are a number of community ranches that have been started up where these chiefdoms and communities have been given 100% user rights within these fenced areas. And we would say these are pilots to see the extent to which communities can utilize wildlife in different setups away from the traditional quota system and GMAs and open areas, but also seeing how they can be better supported to actually, in some areas, manage wildlife in fenced areas. I think for Zambia, it would have to be a combination of the different routes that have been done by some of our neighbors. There's a lot of similarities, but also differences within the countries. So issues such as population, for example, and what are some of the prevailing cultural practices around game and how that would impact having several open conservancies in the country and so on and so forth. So we would have to, like Ian has said, debate our own truth and our own clarity as Zambia and go down that path. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you have anyone who has a question? Just to say to you that Susan has sent her apologies. She has another task, so she has exited. So if there are any questions directed at the DNPW, we can receive them and pass them on to her. Next week, she's back to present on the community game ranching. So some of the issues, I'm sure she'll touch on them. Anyone who wants to speak, you can raise your hand so that I can give you space to talk. Anyone? I can't see a hand here. Okay, I have one hand. Who wanted to speak? Is it Matt?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. So after you,
Great.
Roy wants to come back, he'll speak. Yeah.
Yeah, I was hoping that maybe, you know, in addition to ranches, there's a whole nother set of services that needed to be developed across Zambia. I think a couple of the presentations sort of alluded to it. Can you reflect on any of the changes and the development of those services and where you see the biggest growth? I know that security has advanced in recent years, and I think there's a few more processing abilities, but where are the tension points and opportunities there, if you don't mind?
Who wants
and
to?
that's to anybody who would like to,
Yes.
feels comfortable answering. Thanks.
Who wants to answer that? To go first? Anyone in the house?
I can start, and I think Ian can chip in.
Go first, Chanda.
Sure, thanks, Matt. That's a brilliant question. There is definitely need for more specialized services as the wildlife economy sector grows. There has been some growth around security and specialized security companies, which is good trajectory in one sense. But then there is also need to manage that and balance that out with ensuring that we're still looking at the community benefits side of things. Because as we all know, the flat out militia doesn't always work. There has to be a fine balance between that. The other specialized service I would say is professional harvesting. So we need more specialized professional harvesters who are able to get the legal game meat to market. So there is scope for that, I believe, in Zambia. The third one I would say is actually increasing the number of scientists and ecologists who provide services to game ranchers. So, for example, the annual game counts being executed by trained ecologists. And these are people who can then earn a living, but then that also improves the quality of the data that is being submitted to regulatory bodies like DNPW. And it goes beyond being a rough estimate that has been done, fair enough, by somebody who has experience for 30 years. But then there's also the ecology and the actual science to creating rigorous data. And I would say that in and of itself could be a slight point of tension, because if this is something you've always done a certain way, why would you need to pay a 30-year-old ecologist to come and count your game? So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Chanda, for making those contributions. Let me get back to Professor Vinya to give us to give a contribution.
Hi, I see that we are coming to the end of this. So I just wanted
Yes.
an announcement, really.
Oh, good.
Just in case it's not on your agenda. Just to remind all the participants that tomorrow we are running a webinar, another one by ILG, which is basically looking at the community forestry. And for tomorrow, we are looking at the issues around the challenges of scaling up community forestry, as well as the need to promote the non-alternative livelihoods in providing an incentive to the CFMGs. So I encourage all of you to tune in exactly the same time, 13 hours to 15 hours. Thanks, Alst.
You're welcome. That was a promotion. So tomorrow we'll have, as he has indicated. Do we have another person in the house who want to speak? You can raise your hand so that I can give you time to talk. Ian, is it another hand or?
Yes, just to elaborate on Matt's question, I think Chanda answered it almost fully.
Right.
When it talks to add-on services that have been provided, she talked of security, which is a big one. I believe game capture and veterinary services is something that is thriving and increasing. I see the employment within the sector, more interest in wildlife. It's creating employment of actual specialists that have gone to school in wildlife, which involves skill development sets, etc. And then on your other hand, but in a small way, as it gets more and more to your ornamentals, is there's been an increase in your feed companies and your medicament companies for the dips and feeds, etc., required to keep animals in the ornamental sector. So I think that's what I'd like to add to that. And then finally, the one that needs a lot of attention, but Matt didn't ask that question, would be a processing tannery is something that was on the cards at one stage and COVID hit, but that would be something that would take the utilization of game products to another level, as well as a taxidermy service. So I think I could leave it at there. Thank you, Alston.
Thank you very much, Rolf. We have a few minutes to close. So Rolf, please make quick contributions.
Yeah, well, just one issue as we go forward. If we're going to develop two policies, one for private fenced properties and deregulate that so that it can work as a business, more like livestock, I think that's the way we all agree it needs to go. And then the other one is to try and expand the public wildlife estate unfenced and create incentives for people to attract animals to their area by good stewardship of the habitat and the land. We run into this problem where private wildlife estate, this last year is a very good example, several times have entered public wildlife estate to do game capture. Now, if this is just for a breeding purpose and a few animals, one would understand. But we're seeing large numbers of animals. Really, it looks like a restocking of private wildlife estate from the public wildlife estate. And this will create conflict points. So this needs to be sorted out very, very clearly, I think. I won't say any more.
Thank you very much, Rolf. And at this point in time, I want to thank all of you who have participated in this webinar today. As we have indicated, this is just one of the many webinars that are coming ahead of us. One of them on forestry, community forest management, is coming up tomorrow at the same time from 13 hours to 15 hours Zambian time. On Thursday next week, we have one on community game ranching, and we'll carry on Friday with another one on forestry, community forest management. I will now hand over we will send a link to all of you for the webinars tomorrow. We'll send to all of you the link for webinars tomorrow. Let me now hand over the floor to Chilombo to conclude this webinar. Chilombo, can come on. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Alston. Very interesting discussion there, and not much to say really, other than to just thank everyone for joining us today, and also to ask for your participation in tomorrow's and all the other webinars that are coming up. And we expect that the discussions tomorrow will also be as lively as today's was. I really enjoyed listening to everyone's input. So thank you so much, and we will see you all tomorrow. Thank you.